Good afternoon, good evening. A warm welcome to this session on learning from multiple perspectives in peace building. My name is Corinne Graff, and I'm a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace. This panel is organized by the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Busara Center, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator. This discussion will explore a particularly important aspect of locally led and owned peace building, and that is understanding the role of perceptions amongst international and local peace building organizations, as well as the implications of differing perspectives and what those can have on results on the ground. Among our panelists, we have a leading peace building scholar who has long-standing experience conducting research on perceptions and behavior in peace building. She will help provide us with a conceptual framework for understanding their role and how to deepen collaboration among key peace-building stakeholders. We want to keep this conversation grounded, so we've also invited several leading peace builders and practitioners from Africa who have firsthand experience with the challenge of donor peace builder collaboration. I will briefly introduce each of them momentarily, but note that you can find their bios in the Forum app or online. The need to localize development and peace-building programs by working directly with local organizations is a well-established best practice. At the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, Grand Bargain signatories committed to action and to removing the barriers to partnering with local organizations. 5 years later, all indications are that little progress has been made. There are no good definitions or measurements of aid localization, so trends are difficult to ascertain. But according to the latest annual assessment of donor commitments under the Grand Bargain, less than 25% of donor funding is currently provided directly to local organizations. By some estimates, that number is much lower, as low as 2% of official development assistance. That is to say, the bulk of ODA in crisis situations is still delivered through large implementing organizations based in donor countries. There are many reasons for the lack of progress, some of which have been discussed in other forum sessions over the past 2 days, including the onerous compliance requirements imposed by donors. As a result of the COVID pandemic, funding for peace building has also become more scarce as other priorities have crowded out this space. One issue that impedes more collaborative approaches but remains poorly understood is the role of perception biases among international and local peace building partners. Survey research into the perceptions of local organizations and communities in conflict environments remains all too scarce. What research we do have suggests that donors and local peace builders don't see eye to eye. One recent multi-country survey of respondents in crisis situations shows that donors and people in affected communities see things quite differently. They have very different assessments of whether local organizations are receiving sufficient aid and whether they have the capacity to provide quality aid and programs. People in conflict-affected communities believe they have very little influence over international aid and programs, and that these often are not responsive to communities' needs, again, according to some recent polling. So to help us understand what is required to achieve closer collaboration between peace-building stakeholders and to have a candid conversation about how to move forward more effectively, I'm honored to be joined by 4 distinguished panelists. First, we have Millicent Otieno, who's the founder of Local Capacities for Peace International, an NGO based in Kenya that promotes conflict-sensitive development. Second, we have John Calker joining us from Sierra Leone, who founded and serves as executive director of Fambotak, a very innovative process that has supported and helped to scale community-led and owned reconciliation in Sierra Leone. We also have Amy Potter Czechowski, who's Director of Global Learning at Catalyst for Peace, a peace-building foundation based in the US that has partnered with Fambotak. And we have Marike Schomeris, Vice President at the Busara Center in Nairobi, and formerly Director of the Program on Politics and Governance and of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortiums at the Overseas Development Institute in London. I would like to remind our participants that as you hear from our panelists, please feel free to share any reactions or questions in the chat function. We will also leave some time toward the end of our discussion for questions and answers. And you will see that we will be sharing 3 polls during the session, so you will have an opportunity to contribute to the conversation that way as well. So with that, Marike, I'd like to start with you. What do we know about citizens, how citizens and donors see conflict situations, and why perceptions matter? Why do these matter? Can you help us understand why they should be important to donors and how they impact programs and policy interventions?
Yes, thanks. Wonderful to be here. Very nice to see familiar names popping up. Corinne, you gave us a few concepts that I think are worth unpacking. You talked about perception bias and why perceptions are so important. And I want to introduce a few ways of thinking about it that have become very prominent in the research work that we've been doing. So one thing that is really important is this idea of perception bias. What does it mean? It means that everyone comes to whatever piece of work they do with a kind of limited set of knowledge that each human brings to the table. And perception bias specifically refers to this mechanism that often kicks in as a way to make sense of a lot of information that really settles on a few simplistic assumptions or stereotypes that then are very easily deployable. Everyone does that. It's a very human thing to do. And it's very useful to just know that this is a human way of dealing with a lot of information. So now, how does this relate to this question that is so important to this panel about legitimacy, about what are legitimate institutions, what is a relationship between governments, between different actors, between communities, in which each considers the other legitimate. And this concept of legitimacy has been a really good example of when perception bias kicks in, because legitimacy, I would argue, is one of the concepts that has been most shaped in the past 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, in the donor community by this perception bias, by this idea that there's essentially a very simple way of understanding it, and that way can be applied no matter where you go. And that way of applying this perception of what legitimacy is, this very prominent mental model that particularly donors have about how legitimacy comes about, is a very transactional one. And it's centered very much around delivery of service and repayment through legitimacy. So you've all encountered this. You can still see it in many, many program documents. If, for example, a state wants to be legitimate to its community, they need to improve their service delivery, and the community will repay with legitimacy, with accepting the state. Now, the research that we did with the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium over many years shows us it's just not that straightforward. This rather simple assumption just doesn't hold. And that, I think, is useful to go back to this question, well, what is legitimacy? If you look up definitions, it's a very nice sounding concept. It's about acceptance. It's about sticking to the same rules, agreeing that these rules are nice, that they're good. But actually, what that tells you underneath it, that this is all about a relationship. There's always various parties involved who need to be accepting of each other. And that, I think, is how we have come to think about it, that actually legitimacy continues to be a negotiated aspect. It's not simply an exchange of things. It can't be transacted. But what can happen is that there are particular issues that become very important to communities, and along the lines of these issues, this relationship of mutual acceptance continues to be negotiated. But what's really important is that what this issue is can be completely different from context to context. And this is why these perception biases, these simple assumptions of if you deliver better services, then more legitimacy will be gained, don't work. And so the last point I want to make is about, well, if it's so context dependent, then what do donors need to know, and why is it so difficult to know something? And I want to share my screen and give you an image which I think helps explain this. So what you see here is a satellite image of planet Earth. I think all of us are very comfortable looking at this. It's the big picture, right? We understand this is the planet. So you go a little bit closer and it starts to, some contours are emerging, but some things are maybe a little less clear because, so it's some green and some blue. So, there's some land and some water, but already contextual knowledge is getting a little bit tricky because you would really need to understand exactly where you are. And so I'm trying to take us to this particular part of the world. And again, think of this as your knowledge, your contextual knowledge. So Here you understand the big contours. We're looking at Sweden. We're zooming in onto Stockholm. This is the moment when you recognize, okay, we're in Stockholm. This is when it seems like contextual knowledge, big picture, merge with each other. And then it gets very, very tricky, because the closer you get, the more contours emerge, the more detail emerge, the more things become clearer and yet at the same time less clear. And so you move in and you realize that maybe this very detailed contextual knowledge is starting to grasp. And then all of a sudden, the more you go into detail, the unclearer it gets. And you emerge in this deep context where actually detailed knowledge is so hard to put back into this big picture with which many, many donors start to look at a concept, that it becomes very difficult to understand how your big picture, your image of what a particular context is like, really relates to what you see when you zoom into this. And this is where this knowledge exchange becomes so important between actors who come with the big picture and those who really understand, who are in the 3D version of this satellite picture, right? Who don't look at it from outside, but are inside it and can help understand. So I wanted to leave you with that image because I find it a very helpful way to imagine what the knowledge needs are, and also where they clash. The big picture of the planet, the ability to zoom in, but then to lose kind of orientation. That is exactly the moment when it is really necessary to connect with what local issues and local perceptions of issues are. So I'll leave it here for now. I'm sure we can come back to some of these points.
Thank you so much, Marieke, for that. And you've already started to get into this, but I wanted to follow up with a question about if donors want to do this, if they want to reflect citizens' perceptions better in their programming and local understandings of legitimacy, and understanding also that legitimacy is a negotiated process, as you've demonstrated so well in the SLRC's research. What should they do? Do you have any advice for donors on, or what are the kinds of things they need to be doing to reflect the context specificity of perceptions and understandings of legitimacy?
I think there's two things. One is, the first thing I would always argue is, if you want to understand where your knowledge comes from, so you need to ask yourself, right? So I think it's a really useful moment for people to turn almost the mirror on themselves and say, well, why is it that I think this? Where do I stand at the moment with my perspective of the satellite image? Why do I think that this is how legitimacy operates in this particular context? Is it because I come at this from preconceived notions, from an established mental model with which the donor community tends to work with legitimacy, or is it something else? That is a really, really crucial reflective process that I think often humans simply tend to skip. And the second really important question to ask oneself, I think, is, well, what do I really want to understand about how people in that particular context perceive their situation? Do I want to understand the perceptions that people have as a way to measure the success of my own program? So do I take it basically as a barometer to say, okay, perceptions are improving or they're deteriorating, so something is wrong or something is going well for me? Or is it because I want to understand exactly along the lines along which lines issues are negotiated here? And that, to me, is the crucial step that needs to be taken, to go from what is the perception of people of what is, the legitimacy of certain actors, to the question, well, what exactly is the underpinning issue that feeds this perception? It's very, very reassuring to do a perception survey and find out that perceptions have improved. It doesn't actually tell you very much about underpinning issues, which arguably is where programs should be working. But I think what's important is to understand that the challenges that happen in this process are very human. It is very, very human to say, okay, I know certain things, so I will apply my knowledge, my insights in a way that I know work in other places. This is not necessarily even a conscious process. So this self-reflection, I think, is really very crucial, and understanding that all of us need to permanently question our assumptions in this way.
Thank you for that, Marieke. Thank you for that reminder that we all come to situations of peace building with our own biases. Thank you for reminding us legitimacy in particular is subjective, and that we need to constantly be asking ourselves what mental models we're coming with. I wanted to pause here because I think perceptions are one of the potential obstacles to closer collaboration, but there are others. And so we'd like to do a poll at this point of what are the obstacles to donors funding local peacebuilding organizations. And we welcome everyone's feedback on this question. So you should be seeing the poll on your screen. With that, I will move on at this point to Millicent, who is with us. And I'd like to ask Millicent to offer her thoughts based on her experiences leading a peacebuilding NGO in Kenya. So Millicent, how much do citizen perceptions and their understanding of legitimacy factor into your own work? What has your experience been with this? And then what types of peacebuilding and development programs have succeeded in being viewed by citizens as responsive to their needs and legitimate? So that's a lot to bite off, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Karina, and we are really grateful for all the people who have been able to join this session. And of course, as we go into this, the definition of perception has already been given. And as has been said, I work in a local organization based in Kenya, although we work outside Kenya. But I wanted to give some examples that we have gone through and our own experiences that has to do with perceptions and issues of legitimacy. And of course, later on, we will see how outsider, insider, vis-a-vis community, NGO relationships look like, and also government service provision and the communities also look like. So to answer your question, first, I wanted to say that our work has been first and foremost to ensure that we talk to our partners. Those include government, department, and also people who are involved in the NGO work, and as well as communities, community-based organizations, to ensure that their work are conflict sensitive, be it humanitarian work, be it development work, be it advocacy work, or even peace building, because we've realized that peace building work can be very conflict blind to the extent that you want to serve communities and help them disengage from violence, but your interventions in the process end up exacerbating tensions within those communities. And in the process, you lose your legitimacy. And I say this because we go in with the perception that we know what the conflicts are about. And so as you provide your services, you think that you are solving issues based on your own understanding and your meaning-making or sense-making process as an intervener, minus the input that comes really from the organization. And at the same time, when we do this peace building collaboratively, we work with the government institutions. For example, we work very closely with the commissions, National Cohesion and Integration Commission. People have a different view about the commission because they think the commission should be delivering a certain service. And they feel that the commission has fallen short when they see that those who are propagating hate speech are not being arrested and taken to court. So when you go with that institution and people ask you, are you really coming to make a difference if you're coming to negotiate so that communities in conflict have an agreement that will lead to a peaceful conflict resolution? So already their mindset, they have a lot of questions. At the same time, we work very closely with the National Steering Committee on Peace Building and Conflict Transformation. This is housed under the Ministry of Interior and Coordination in Kenya. This is also the ministry that is responsible for police work. So people ask, the police are known to be brutalizing people. How are you going to convince us that they are good people? And at this point, I just wanted us to see a slide because perception, the first slide I wanted to show is they say pictures speak volumes. So the work that we have been doing in community policing, and Amanda, if you may, just share with us the first slide where we have wanted to show some of the work we do with community policing, because we work with the police officers and try to talk about service to the people, because law enforcement is a requirement in our societies. And so many a times during electoral processes, police are known or are perceived, and the people think that they don't come in with good intent. And as you can see in the photos, we have the first photo, which was taken in 2017 during an electoral process where protesters in one of our counties in Kisumu County were protesting, and the police had come to offer service. Their service was to ensure protection of property and human beings, no loss of life, so that the electoral process is done in a meaningful and safe, secure way. But on the second hand, you see that as they were dispersing the protesters, one of the trucks that was being used to the water canal that was being used to disperse the people fell in a ditch. And you can see here that the relationship between the police and the people is slightly different. The second photo shows us youth helping the police get out the cannon from a ditch. And these are the same people who are throwing tear gas at them. So you ask yourself, is it that there's some sort of legitimacy? What kind of relationship is there between the youth and the police? It means that it is not an acrimonious relationship. But from the face value, people always assume, and people have this perception that the police are the enemy of the people. So the people of Kisumu, and especially the youth here in this photo, prove to us that that perception is very wrong. So if you were going as an intervener to intervene with that mindset, then you know already that legitimacy questions can be put to rest. And you can say that people actually somehow had the trust. The last photo I wanted us to look at is this police woman escorting a civilian. Because one of the things that happened when COVID affected all countries, we have had curfews in our nation, in Kenya. And here you see, instead of the policewoman arresting this civilian who may have been seen to have broken the law, she is actually escorting her and providing her safety and security. So as we talk about legitimacy being a negotiated process and relationship, it speaks to the idea of building trust and working with these people who are service providers to help them understand that they are part and parcel of our community. And this is one of the work that local capacities police has been doing as we work on community policing, as we blend it with peace building. It is nuanced in such a way that you say, as we want to prevent violent conflict, how do we support the responders? Because the police, we see them as responders in part of our conflict early warning and real-time response system because of their role in the society. So I just wanted to start by saying that this does not just happen in vacuum. This happens when people invest in relationship building, trust building, dialogue processes, ensuring that there is troubleshooting, and also ensuring that when there is a need to enforce the law, it is done in a manner that does not dent or completely damage the relationship. And in one of, I just mentioned Kisumu County because that is one of the counties where we've been working. And these photos help us to see the kind of interventions that we have been doing, trying to organize activities so that the police can also interact with the youth, interact with the elders, interact with the women. And so we have a process where people get to understand each other and shifting the mindset so that the enmity or the othering is lessened. I hope that kind of tries to speak to some of the things you wanted us to talk about, and I want to pause at this point because I think I have touched on both the 2 points. We will have some time to talk about in details the other interventions and government departments and how that looks like in the next slide. So back to you, Corina, and if you want to ask the other question, or if something is not satisfactorily answered, I'm still here. Thank you.
No, this is great, Millicent. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that legitimacy really is negotiated through a relationship or throughout the course of a relationship. So it's a process, as you said, that has to be invested in. So I did want to follow up with you and ask, what are the implications of that for donors who want to support the work that you're doing to, as you say, support the police as better respondents? And then I also wanted to ask you, in addition to what are the implications for donors, what have you seen as far as biases that donors bring to your work and to supporting your work? And how do you think their perceptions and biases in your experience have affected peacebuilding outcomes and your ability to do your work at the local level?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a great question. And actually, the implications for donors is, first and foremost, even going back to the presentation that was done earlier, when COVID happened, funding shifting started happening. And I just want to mention the most recent one, because peace building in the era of pandemic has not been very easy, because in some cases we have had to shift budgets from the typical peace building work, and also now try to negotiate and have dialogue around enforcement of rule of law, protocols, how to observe, how people are supposed to be kept safe at the same time, to ensure that we live or deliver based on objectives and original goals that we set with the donors when we were applying for the funding. And so first and foremost, what happened in our case is the demand for donors they ask of us to give back some of the money or to shift into other activities, whereas we were telling them this is what the ground is telling us. Sometimes it's very difficult because the funding was given with a certain mindset. And I know that, and we understand that some of the donors also have back donors, which are governments. And so it's a real quagmire because they are also being pushed. So one of the things that happened to us is when we had to now cut down interventions that were so crucial, and we couldn't proceed because some of them needed, face-to-face kind of meeting, and now we had to go virtual. And some of the areas you can't engage people on a virtual basis because not everybody has the connectivity of internet. Not everybody has those gadgets that they are supposed to use to be able to access these safe spaces. And not everybody also knows how to use them. And the time limits, and sometimes you were compelled to do something within a certain time, and you're like, wait a minute, come on, this is not the best time for this. And for the donors, it's like, find a way around it. And it's not working because the community is telling you, for example, when COVID happened, let me give a real life example. When COVID happened, one of the areas we are working in was affected because of floods. So it was not just COVID, but it was also climate change related things. And so people were displaced. COVID rules tells us that you have to keep distance. These people are crowded in camps, camp-like, displacement, either they're in schools or they are in some spaces. And here we are supposed to go and visit them. There's already tension because they don't have food. And there's already tension because according to protocol, they are supposed to keep distance. And we are going there to say, you know what, we were talking about those issues of tensions about land and how do we then proceed with this relationship building between you and the police who are coming to insist that you must abide by the protocols. And in some cases, if you are late in the evening because you went to look for food and you are not in your home because you're displaced, so you have to travel further. And then you are caught by the police, and then either they are caning you or you are being arrested. And people just don't understand it. And then as peace builders, we are supposed to help them negotiate or even be part of the fast responders as we, because we needed cards to be fast responders. We had pregnant women who were supposed to be giving birth, who were supposed to access health facilities. And because of COVID, you can't move at night. And the border people, the public transport cannot also access this hospital. If they try to support the women, they get arrested. So these were the kind of spaces where, donor funding was not provided for that. But you have to be creative to work with the police to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to provide safe passage for these women because a pregnant woman will not wait because COVID is happening. She has to give birth, and she has to give birth in a safe place. So excuse me, Mr. Police or Mrs. Policewoman, can you, so basically those kind of things, it means shuttle diplomacy, it means a lot of preventative diplomacy also, because people then start having a perception that the police are just being biased. They don't want us to access services. And yet there are people who are breaking the law. There were those also who were just waiting for the curfew hour to go out and cause chaos. And criminal activity also increased because people were now in the houses. And so finding a balance in our work, we had to deal with all this. These are not things that we had in the proposal, but we had to come up with the intervention in such a manner that we still have to work with our community policing committees, our peace committees in the communities, because the peace committees and the community policing committees and the court users committees, these are all infrastructure. It means the donors had worked with us before to set up some structures and systems that we could fall back on. But remember, if these teams are not well equipped, do you think they can negotiate in such a market situation? They can't. And therefore, if they are able to negotiate passage, their legitimacy goes up. And people feel like, oh my God, so you mean peace building makes sense? It was the peace builder who actually delivered relief food, because we had to negotiate even with the Rotary Club, and they gave us food and we were distributing instead of doing our usual peace work. So you see, the implication for the donors is the flexibility. They have to be flexible. And of course, we were lucky and happy that we had to negotiate. Some of the organizations are not so lucky because people sometimes are shy. You think that if you're going to negotiate with your donor, the funding will go all the same. So I think trust building and confidence and mutual relationship, some sort of partnership, so that it is not boss and a lower, person. So that is what helped us. So the biases also from the donors also was addressed, because they felt even your work with the police. In the past, they thought, having police play football with the community teams, and maybe at this point, I want to show the second slide. Kindly just, Amanda, if you don't mind, just show the second slide, because I'm just winding up. And that also speaks to the perception. So this second slide, again, as I said, and Corina reinforced, it's a process. It's not event. And our relationship with the police goes on even after the project has ended. It does not mean that when the donors funding ends, local capacities for peace stops relating with the police. You can see here, these are all top police officers in the photo. And this was a session we were having, and we had several of them. On your left-hand side, there is the one we had with the police. On the right-hand side, you can't even identify who is the police and who is not the police, because even the county commissioner was there, but they're all in civilian, almost all of them except one. They're in civilian. And so their biases, when donors see this, they ask, are these really police? So in that way, we help to inform and shape the biases. And I think I want to end by an example. When the people were brutalized during the post-election experience in 2017 in Kisumu, and people went to ask them, is it true that the police brutalized you? The response they got, our police did not beat us. So we were shocked. Even our donors came, now FCDO, that time DFID, they came and they went to the field, and they were asking us, how come people are saying our police? Are you seeing the level of legitimacy and ownership and acceptance? Our police did not beat us means they had developed a relationship. The othering feelings had been declined. It doesn't mean it is perfect. But let me also say, this is sometimes personality-based. The individual that was there at that time, or the individuals, it's collective, might have put more effort. And if you come to the ground today, you will see that the relationship is not as strong as it was then. It means, therefore, for us, we have to keep working to ensure that that legitimacy is there, but service provision must also be people-centered, and our biases can be challenged, and our stereotypes can be changed, and our prejudices reduced. And in that way, we help our donors also understand that the context always can change and has changed for the better. Back to you, Corina.
Thank you so much for that, Millicent, and for those examples. I wanted to come back to the response to the first poll, which showed that while I think many of our participants agree that perceptions are important and can get in the way of closer collaboration with local organizations, one of the biggest problems is the lack of flexible funding for donors. And I think you touched on that a little bit, Millicent. So thank you for reminding us and giving us some very concrete examples of how, on account of the COVID pandemic, the needs changed. And so you needed different kinds of interventions. And the flexibility of the donor programs and funds is critical. We'd like to do a second poll at this point that will build on something that Millicent talked about as well, which is how do donors perceive the capacity of local organizations? And how do they rate it? And what is the perception generally of what local organizations are able to accomplish and what their capacity is? So you should have that on your screen, and we'll pull up the results in a minute. And with that, I would like to pivot to a little bit more forward-looking conversation about how donors and peace builders can collaborate more closely and what models are out there. And I'd like to turn to John and Amy to talk about the Fambultak process in particular. It seems to me that the level of collaboration that was achieved between Catalyst for Peace, the organization that Amy works for, and the Fambultak process, with John Kalker is the executive director, required really deep awareness of the biases that both donors and peace builders bring to peace building and to the communities in which they work. Was this in fact the case, John and Amy? And can you talk us through how you dealt with this issue and overcame any differences of view to achieve the close collaboration that is really quite exceptional? So maybe I will turn to John first and then Amy to answer that question. John, I think you're on mute.
Hello, good afternoon from Sierra Leone. Thank you for having me. I'll first start by explaining what Fambultak is. Fambultak is Creole for family talk, and it's a community-owned and led healing and reconstruction process that leads to sustainable development. I will say from the get-go in our partnership, we went to communities, we designed the program knowing that the answers are in the community. We were not going to communities with a preconceived mind to say, we are going to solve your problems. We went in there knowing very well that local solution to local problems is more sustainable. We don't have the answers to everything. And that was the premise for our partnership. I'll give one example. When we started, initially, the understanding was, okay, we want to have consultations, because I told my partners that for now, we cannot design a program. We need to consult with the people. How do they want to reconcile? What exists in their community? I, as a human rights advocate by then, cannot just say this and this and this is what to do. But let's go to the people. Let's consult with them. And then whatever they say, we can either respond or accompany them. That was the basis. And it was so simple. Simple questions like, do you want to reconcile? Open the door to cooperation. How do you want to go about it? They were so willing to say, we have our tradition. We have ways to reconcile. From the outside, donors will think what happened in Sierra Leone is unreconcilable. Because for children to kill their parents and the rebels to put elders in the house to set the house ablaze, it's unimaginable. But we knew that all what happened in Sierra Leone was between and among Sierra Leoneans. Well, there was some role from the outsiders who fear the conflict. But how do we have that conversation? That was the premise. And I think the way we designed the program first to build trust, to give the ownership of the program to the people. We did not go to communities to say, okay, Catalyst for Peace, Fambultak, we are here. Do X, Y, Z. No. We said, what do you want to do? And we were able to bring in our human rights lens to guide the design process. To say, okay, hey, the tradition says the men should decide what to do in communities. We said, excuse us, no. Women suffer the brunt of the conflict. How do we get women to also participate in this conversation? Don't drive kids away because they are kids. During the conflict, they were not driven away. They were victims. They were victimized. So it's a community conversation. And so these are the little things we bring in. But our role as partners, I mean, the donor, and for us as peace building, as a local organization was clear. We were there to facilitate. And I think the flexibility that was demonstrated by Catalysts for Peace from the get-go to say, we wanted to work at the chiefdom level. That was the initial concept, to say, let's do 161 chiefdoms across Sierra Leone, then we have the answer, we can move forward. But after the first few district consultations, people said, no, we don't want to talk at that level. It's too big. We want intimate conversation at the village level, at the sectional level. Well, they wanted at village level, so we had to compromise at the sectional level. Sectional level is a couple of villages combined to make one section, and then a couple of sections leads to one chiefdom. So basically, the program was led by the people. We accompany them. And Catalysts for Peace, we have our challenges from time to time, but we had the courage to go through difficult conversation. I cannot sit here and say everything was rosy, no. But it was the understanding, the willingness to go through difficult conversation to say, hey, this will work, this will not work, let's go to the people. And when we went to the communities, because as I said, it's a community-owned and led program, but the role Catalysts for Peace played was not just as donors. They also accompanied the process. They were there to document and to learn, to share the learning. So they need to be present. And in an Africa set, in a Sierra Leone setting, when you go to a village, you are accompanied by white people, there's the perception that, oh, they are here to give handouts. They are, just after the war, they are here to give handouts. They come with everything. We have to tell them, no, we work differently. We are not like just an NGO to come and we are here to work with you, to consult with you. How do we work together? So, we agree to introduce ourselves from the start. When we go to a village, these are our white friends. They are here to listen, to observe. So these little things help to to address the perception issue. And the lens which we use in the post-conflict was the same lens we used in the post-Ebola. Where we witness, a lot of the same mistakes made in the post-conflict were made in the post-Ebola. So we want to see, now that we are looking at the COVID-19, how do we avoid those mistakes? And the only way we believe is through a people's-led peace-building program. We have what is called the One Family National Framework for Inclusive Peace and Development. Now we are in discussions with the government of Sierra Leone to scale this program nationwide. I don't even want to say we are in discussion. We have an agreement now. We are just discussing the details, how to scale the process nationwide. I think I'll pass on to Amy to add and clarify maybe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was very helpful. And thank you for that description of the role of donors and peace-building organizations as facilitators of a peace process, and the need for courage in supporting those local processes and a willingness to do it, of course. Amy, I'd love to give you a chance to jump in as well. And if you could comment in particular on Catalysts for Peace's perspective on Fumble Talk and on the local capacity that was there. How did you view that from where you stood?
Well, I think to underscore John's first point, what grounded our work and our partnership was the total conviction that the answers were there in the communities, and for there to be sustainable peace and then later development, the communities had to be capable of doing it. Like, there was really no other choice, because if they're not capable, what are we doing? Why would we be there? Why would we be offering an intervention? So I think we started with that premise, and then we kept the question very much alive in our partnership. What does it take to support communities in them coming into their leadership around peace and development? So maybe it's already there. So asking that question, what are the resources already there? What's happening? What's getting in the way in communities? And then so in Fumble Talk's case, how can a national organization support a community in being able to see where the cracks are and repair them. So the community can come together to effectively prioritize, identify the conflicts they need to work through, design their processes. So what does it take for a national organization to do that? And then on Catalyst for Peace's side, what does it take for an international donor organization to do that, to support a national organization that's supporting communities? So I think that we were, I don't know if I should say comfortable, but we were really committed from the very beginning to change and to morph. And we knew it was going to have to happen, right? Because if a community was going to own the process, they had to be part of saying what needed to happen. So on our first, I guess, meeting that we had, when we sort of mapped out what we thought the first year would look like, maybe we even started with 6 months. We came up with something, and then John said, I got to go back and talk with the communities, right? So went back, spent 2 weeks talking with people all over the country, and then we came back together and said, okay, does it make sense what we came up with? Does something have to change? And then what are the modifications that need to happen? We didn't start with, there's an organization that has to look like this, and this is who we are, and we have to stay static. We assume that we're just going to have to keep learning and changing over time. And then, part of that is how do we effectively communicate with each other? And of course, biases are going to get in the way. Cultural conditioning is part of what we all have, and it's always going to be there. So how can we get better at seeing it and seeing when it's getting in the way? And I think it really helped to have really close partnership from the beginning, and lots of opportunities to talk with one another, to build trust, to have frank conversations. And John is probably, the most masterful person I know in having frank, respectful conversations. So I think he modeled so much of that. And I think we tried to keep that going, as hard as it was. It was very hard at different times. And I think too, what's important to internalize is that conflict's hard. It is. It's hard everywhere, right? And as a donor and project partner, I have to take on hard stuff too. I mean, these are difficult issues. So keeping those lines of communication open. There were points where we brought in a trusted mediator to help us work through things. And in those hard conversations, I think that's when biases really come out. And perceptions, they start becoming clear, because when you start hearing how what you're doing is landing for someone, you start seeing it in a way that you hadn't before. And I think vice versa. And then you have to sit with that and go, what do I need to do to change? What do I do with my cultural conditioning? How can I be with that? Just a really simple example. There's an event that I'm putting on in a couple of weeks. And we're going to have community members from a few different places come and speak with a group of donors, INGOs, NGOs about what they want more of and less of from external partners. And the person who's working at a community organization who I'm talking with, who is inviting the community folks to come to that, it doesn't work for her to have a meeting with me on Zoom and them in advance. I'm not so comfortable with that, right? The cultural norms that I come from are you want to try to control things as much as you can. You want to try to be efficient, and that's going to require a pre-conversation. So I have to sit with that discomfort, and I have to become better at being with what is, not trying to control outcomes, not trying to just work on efficiency. I think there are so many Western cultural norms, and not just Western cultural norms, but that's where I'm coming from, that basically get in the way of supporting effective peace building, completely get in the way. I mean, this whole mindset around efficiency, things need to happen quickly. My value and worth comes out of what I accomplish. These all get in the way. So I think, you know, organizationally trying to create the communication between our two organizations, and also in Catalyst for Peace, how can we make sure that we have a safe space for naming and identifying those aspects of cultural conditioning that create our biases on a regular basis, and really challenge those.
Thank you, Amy. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to come back to the poll results of the last poll. And so I will turn to Marieke to comment on that. And then maybe we can also at the same time pull up our third poll, which asks the question of what are the knowledge needs of donors in order to achieve closer collaboration with community.
Thanks, Corinne. I think what you see in the poll is that the experiences that we've just heard people talk about, Amy and John, are widely shared, that there's a cautious dance, right? Where, of course, there's a willingness to go into partnership, because how else will it work? But it's the ability to truly, Amy, I really like the way you put this, to sit with how things are. And even if that feels uncomfortable or uncertain, I think that seems to be a widely shared experience. So I'll stop sharing these results so that I can launch the next one, which is this question about knowledge needs. We talked a lot about the different types of knowledge that people draw on. And I think that it's a really useful thing to reflect on how people try and learn about the context in which they work. So I'll leave this poll open for a little bit and see what comes up. Back to you, Corinne.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marieke. So I want to get to at least one question we've received in the chat. And I'm going to address that to all of our panelists. Maybe I'll start with Millicent. And the question is, how can donors and implementing organizations design a process for actively incorporating feedback from local stakeholders and civil society partners? So in a more adaptive and flexible approach. So let me turn to Millicent if you have thoughts on that and any advice for donors.
Well, thank you very much. So what we have done, we have several different donors, and I think we as a local organization have tried to bring the experience of consultative, processes. So first and foremost, when we go into an area, more often than not, we have gotten the request from the community. It's not the organization sitting down and saying, this is where the problem is. And so when we bring this request, and most of the time, donors don't invest so much in research. So in the preliminary stages. So what we do is a quick and dirty, kind of assessment. And we come with this, and that is where the conversation starts. So the designing of the intervention is not done mainly with the donor in mind, but with the community needs. And so it is our prerogative and responsibility to come and position those needs and convince the donors. And more often than not, it depends on how long, whether it's a new donor or it's an old donor, and some of them come with the new approaches. So I think first and foremost, their willingness to accept that this is more community need driven rather than the NGO driven. And then it's also not funding driven. And most of our proposal and the designing of the interventions are not just around call for proposal, but they're about needs that are coming up. And so this need is there. And so we approach these traditional donors that we have, but also try to extend to the new ones. The second thing, I think, where the trust issues are, and again, it's about whether donors think there is a legitimacy or lack thereof, and their perception is informed by experience. So it's experiential working, modalities or even mental models. If you have failed with some of the local organizations because of lack of trust or because of transparency or even competency issues, then I think it is about time that donors invested. I am very proud to say that Coffee International invested in local capacities for peace because they felt our systems was not meeting their need. And then they did an organizational capacity assessment and identified some of the gaps. And they said, these are the knowledge gaps, these are the structural gaps, these are the systemic gaps. And so together we worked with them on that. And this is translated to the community as well. So the willingness to invest in even building the competence and the capability of the organizations that you are working with. It's a relationship we are building. It's not about you throwing your money. And that also makes us be accountable enough. So the transparency and accountability issues that hinder good relationship between donors and local organization is dealt with at that point. And so this is again an investment that donors must be willing to but also the civil society organizations must also be willing to go. It's about finding the middle ground so that these things are there, and our own perceptions also as organizations when we are going to look for partnerships. And I think it is important for us to be firm and have our own agency and have our own voice. Because we shouldn't just do things because donors would want us to do them. No, I mean, it is important to also stand firm and say, you know what, because I can give a live example. At one point, we had to turn down the money because we were being forced to intervene at a time when the community was volatile, and the community told us, if you come with this intervention now, we're going to mess things up. And the donor said, no, you must do this thing within this time. So these rigid timelines, it was just impossible for us because our legitimacy was also at stake. So we had to say, you know what, thank you, but no thank you, you can keep your money, let us respect each other. And later on, many years later on, we were able to come back to the table and negotiate. So NGOs also, I think it is very important for us also, as long as we know that we are serving the community and the needs are driven by the communities, we can always also negotiate with the donors. And the donors are not, I don't think they are angels, or, we can work on the shift of mindset and be able to find some amicable and some middle ground in a manner that will be beneficial for all parties concerned. So it's a work in progress. Let's keep chipping at the rock slowly by slowly, one step at a time, and the building blocks will help us to create a relationship that looks like the one described by John and Emmy. And I can also assure you, the teams that we work with from the donor, they don't even see themselves as donors because we do most of the things very collaboratively, very consultatively, and also shifting. It's not about one person having power over the other, but working with each other.
Great, thank you, Millicent. I want to ask Marike if you want to comment on the results of the third poll briefly before we start to close out.
Yes, fantastic. My researcher's heart is really delighted with the results of the third poll because in the three options that we gave you, which Benjamin rightly pointed out, are also limited, there isn't a clear winner. There's not much in it. And I think that's a fantastic result because it just points to the fact that these knowledge needs are really nuanced and multifaceted. And some of them are outward looking and some of them are inward looking. And I think that's a great reminder also from Raphael in the chat that actually the inward looking, the perception testing, the questioning our assumptions needs to happen on all sides. It needs to happen for all actors who want to genuinely engage with each other and understand where everyone is coming from. So thank you for giving us this result, which I think really reflects very accurately some of the challenges that continue to exist.
Thank you, Marike. So I also want to give Amy and John a chance to provide final comments. So I have two questions for you. The first is for John and similar to the question to Millicent, and that is, what advice do you have for donors who are trying to collaborate more closely with local peacebuilding organizations? And then the question for Amy will be, what do you think the prospects are? You've been having this conversation, I know, for some time about closer collaboration between donors and peacebuilding organizations. What do you think the prospects are of getting there? And 1 minute each, because we're really coming to the end here. John, I think you're on mute.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. My advice is simple. We are working as a team. The donors have a role to play. The local peace builders have a role to play. The communities have a role to play. And we all have to We need to work together collaboratively in order to achieve success. And I think, and we also need that container to have difficult conversation. Particularly in Africa, donors look at peace building work in Africa as if it's like, it's an afterthought, or they just come in. It's a process. Donors need to engage in long-term commitments. So to work on 1-2 years project and you go off, the result will be limited. So we will suggest to donors to make a long-term commitment, because that's the only way you can have sustained impact. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, John. Amy?
Yes, I just want to add one quick thing to what John said. I would say also to design in the containers for those conversations. Design it in from the beginning. Don't let that be an afterthought or something that happens when things get hard. Just put it in the beginning and fund it. It's absolutely critical, those lines of communication. And we are in a completely different place right now than we were 6 years ago in terms of support for locally led peace building. 6 years ago, it seemed to be like a really kind of fringe conversation. And now at least the language is very much mainstream. So I think we've come a long way. And I think now we need to really work on the practices and mindsets, approaches that support the language of locally led peace building. So I feel like we're on the way, but we still have a little ways to go.
Thank you, Amy. That's a perfect segue. My very brief conclusion was going to be pulling out some of the key words I heard during this session: courage, commitment, and respect, which really, I think, suggests the kind of attitude that's needed to make this happen. So on behalf of USIP and the Busara Center, I want to thank our panelists for participating today. I want to thank Marieke for her collaboration. I want to thank the Stockholm Forum for the opportunity to organize this discussion. And of course, I want to thank all of the participants who joined us today. Thank you very much, and I hope we can continue the discussion.